The Curse of Frederick Krueger. The city of Ravenswood was a quiet place, at least on the surface. The streets were calm, the houses well-maintained, and the residents lived their lives without major upheavals. But as in any place, there were secrets hidden in the shadows. Secrets that no one dared to speak aloud. Secrets that were only revealed in whispers when the lights went out and the silence of the night took over. It was in that silence that Freddy Krueger appeared. Freddy was not an ordinary man. He was a legend, a figure who inhabited children's nightmares and the deepest fears of adults. No one knew for sure who he was or where he came from, but everyone knew the stories. Stories of a man who could enter people's dreams, a being who fed on fear and the pain of others. He had no face, at least not one that could be clearly described. His image was always distorted, as if it were a fleeting memory of a nightmare. People said that Freddy was the result of a pact made with dark forces. Others claimed that he was a vengeful spirit, condemned to wander between the world of the living and the dead. Regardless of the origin, one thing was certain: Freddy Krueger was real, and he was back. It all started with Sarah, a 17-year-old girl who lived with her parents on Flower Street, one of the oldest in Ravenswood. Sarah was an ordinary girl with an ordinary life. She went to school, spent hours on her phone, and had a crush on the popular boy in class. But in recent days, something was different. She started having nightmares. They weren't ordinary dreams, the kind you forget upon waking up. They were vivid, real. In each one, she saw a man with a hat and a striped coat, with a raspy voice as sharp as a blade. He always appeared at the end, just when she thought she was about to wake up. He whispered her name, and then she woke up, sweating and trembling. At first, Sarah tried to ignore it. After all, they were just dreams, right? But as the nights went by, the nightmares became more intense. She started hearing low laughter, as if someone was always lurking. And worse, she began seeing things during the day. Figures at the corners of her eyes, shadows that moved when they shouldn't. One night, Sarah decided to tell her parents. They looked at her with concern, but tried to reassure her. "They're just nightmares, sweetheart. It will pass." But Sarah knew it was more than that. She felt that something was wrong, very wrong. That same night, the nightmare returned. This time, it was different. Sarah was in a dark corridor with walls that seemed to breathe. She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. Then she heard the voice. "Sarah," whispered the raspy voice. "You can't escape." She turned, and there he was, Freddy Krueger. His face was a mix of scars and burns, as if it had been reconstructed multiple times. His eyes glowed with a yellowish light, and his mouth stretched into a smile that never reached his eyes. In his right hand, he held a glove with sharp blades that gleamed under a non-existent light. "You're mine now," he said, moving toward her. Sarah woke up screaming. Her parents ran into the room, but she couldn't stop trembling. She knew it wasn't just a dream. Freddy was there. He was real. While Sarah tried to deal with her nightmares, the rest of the town began to feel Freddy's presence. Other people reported similar dreams, always with the same man wearing a hat and a striped coat. The stories spread quickly, and soon Ravenswood was shrouded in an atmosphere of fear and distrust. It was then that old Thomas, one of the town's oldest residents, decided to tell the truth about Freddy. He gathered a group of people in the central square, including Sarah and her parents, and began to speak. "Many years ago, before you were born, Ravenswood was a very different place," he began, his voice deep and filled with emotion. "At that time, there was a man named Frederick Charles Krueger. He was a gardener, but he also had a dark side. They say he abused children, and no one did anything because he was friends with the important people in town." Thomas paused, looking at the people around him. One day, the families of the victims decided to take justice into their own hands. They captured Frederick, took him to the forest, and burned him alive. But before he died, he made a vow. He said he would return, that he would never leave them in peace. The people fell silent, absorbing the story. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She knew it was real. Freddy Krueger had returned, and he was after her. That night, Sarah tried to stay awake. She didn't want to sleep, didn't want to face Freddy again. But eventually, exhaustion won, and she fell into a deep sleep. She woke up in a dark, damp place with stone walls and the smell of mold in the air. It was a basement, but not an ordinary one. There was something evil in that place, something that made her heart race. "Sarah," whispered the familiar voice, "you can't escape." She turned, and there he was. Freddy Krueger was closer this time, his blades gleaming in the darkness. He laughed, a raspy, guttural sound that echoed off the walls. "You're mine now," he said, moving toward her. Sarah tried to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. She screamed, but no sound came out of her mouth. Freddy was almost touching her when she woke up, sweating and trembling. But something was different this time. When she looked at her hands, she saw scratch marks, and in the mirror there was a message written in a dark, sticky substance. "You're mine now." Sarah could no longer distinguish what was real and what was a dream. The scratch marks on her hands were real, as was the message on the mirror. But how was that possible? How could a man who existed only in nightmares leave marks in the real world? She decided to investigate. If Freddy Krueger was real, then someone in town must know more about him. Someone who could help her understand what was happening. Sarah began her search at the town library. Ravenswood was small, but its library was old and full of historical records. She spent hours digging through archives, looking for any mention of Frederick Charles Krueger. Finally, she found something. In an old newspaper dated 1968, there was a small note about a fire in the forest. The article mentioned a man named Frederick Krueger, who had been lynched by an enraged mob. The circumstances were vague, but one detail caught Sarah's attention. The location of the fire was near an old abandoned factory known as Springwood Foundry. Sarah decided to go there. She didn't know what she expected to find, but she felt she needed to see the place with her own eyes. The factory was a dark and decaying place. The walls were covered in graffiti, and the air smelled metallic and musty. Sarah entered cautiously, holding a flashlight in her hand. Every step she took echoed through the empty building. In the basement, she found what looked like some sort of shrine. Strange symbols were drawn on the walls, and the floor was covered with burnt candles and ashes. In the center of the room, there was an old rusty chair with burn marks. Sarah felt a chill. It was as if the very air was filled with malevolence. She was about to leave when she heard a low, raspy laugh. "You came to me, Sarah," Freddy's voice said. "That was brave, or stupid." She turned, and there he was. Freddy Krueger was sitting in the chair, his blades gleaming in the dim light of the flashlight. His face was even more deformed, as if it had been feeding on her fear. "You can't escape, sweetheart," he said, slowly standing up. "I'm part of you now." Sarah tried to run, but the doors closed on their own. She was trapped. As Sarah fought to escape the factory, other people in Ravenswood began having similar nightmares. Children woke up screaming, talking about a man with blades on his hands. Adults reported vivid dreams where they were chased by Freddy. The town was in panic. People started locking their doors and windows, afraid that Freddy might enter their homes. Some even tried to stay awake, but exhaustion always won. That was when Sarah had an idea. If Freddy existed in dreams, maybe there was a way to fight him there. She began researching lucid dreams and techniques for controlling nightmares, but to do that, she would have to face Freddy again. That night, Sarah prepared herself. She placed a journal beside her bed, where she would write everything that happened in the dream. She also set a clock, hoping to recognize when she was dreaming. When she fell asleep, Freddy was waiting. "You think you can defeat me, Sarah?" He laughed, appearing behind her in a dark corridor. "You're just a scared little girl." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She knew she was dreaming. That meant she could control the dream. "You don't scare me anymore, Freddy," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Freddy stopped laughing. His face twisted into an expression of rage. "You'll learn to respect me," he growled, moving toward her. Sarah closed her eyes and focused. She imagined a door behind her leading to a safe place. When she opened her eyes, the door was there. She ran for it, with Freddy right behind her. "You can't escape!" he shouted, his blades scraping against the walls. Sarah went through the door and found herself in an open field under a starry sky. She was safe, for now. Sarah woke up, gasping for air. She looked at the clock. Only an hour had passed since she had fallen asleep. She grabbed the journal and began writing down everything she remembered. She knew this wasn't the end. Freddy wouldn't give up so easily. But for the first time, she felt like she had a chance. She was learning to fight. However, something still troubled her. As she wrote, she noticed that her hands were covered in soot, as if she had actually been in the factory. Freddy was becoming more real with each passing night. Sarah knew she couldn't face Freddy Krueger alone. He was too strong, too cunning. She needed help, but who would believe her? Who would be willing to confront a nightmare that had become real? She decided to start with her closest friends, Jake, her schoolmate, and Emily, her best friend since childhood. Both had mentioned having nightmares recently, but neither talked about it openly. Sarah knew it was time to confront them. In the school cafeteria, Sarah gathered Jake and Emily in a secluded corner. She looked at them, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "You've been having nightmares, haven't you?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Jake and Emily exchanged glances. It was obvious they were scared, but reluctant to admit it. "Yeah," Jake finally responded. "I dreamed about a strange guy. He had a hat and a glove with blades. He was chasing me." Emily nodded in agreement. "Me too. He whispered my name. I woke up screaming." Sarah took a deep breath. "I know who he is. His name is Frederick Charles Krueger, but he's known as Freddy Krueger. He's not just a nightmare. He's real, and he's hunting us." Jake and Emily remained silent, processing Sarah's words. Finally, Emily asked, "What can we do?" Sarah explained what she had discovered about Freddy. His story, the abandoned factory, and how he seemed to feed on people's fear. She also shared her experience with lucid dreaming, suggesting that they might be able to use similar techniques to confront him. "We need to find a way to stop him," Sarah said. "If he exists in dreams, maybe we can trap him there." Jake seemed skeptical. "And how exactly do we do that? He's basically a nightmare god." "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted, "but we have to try. If we do nothing, he'll get us one by one." That night, Sarah, Jake, and Emily gathered at Sarah's house. They decided to sleep together, hoping that if they entered the same dream, they could face Freddy as a group. Before sleeping, Sarah explained the basics of lucid dreaming, how to recognize when they're dreaming, and how to try to control the environment. "Remember," she said, "Freddy feeds on our fear. If we stay calm, we can weaken him." Sarah woke up in a familiar place, the dark, damp corridor of the abandoned factory. She looked around and saw Jake and Emily nearby, both looking confused and scared. "We're dreaming," Sarah said, trying to stay calm. "Remember, we can control this." Before they could respond, a laugh echoed through the corridor. Freddy Krueger appeared in the distance, his blades gleaming in the darkness. "3 against 1, he said with a cruel smile. "That's not fair. For you." Freddy charged forward, moving with supernatural speed. Jake tried to create a barrier with his mind, but Freddy tore through it as if it were made of paper. Emily screamed, trying to run, but the corridor seemed endless. Sarah focused, imagining a weapon in her hands. A sword appeared, but Freddy laughed. "You think that'll stop me, sweetheart?" he said, dodging the blade with ease. He struck Sarah with his blades, and she fell to the ground, feeling intense pain. Jake tried to help her, but Freddy hit him with a quick blow, leaving him down. Desperate, Emily closed her eyes and focused. She imagined a bright light, something that could drive Freddy away. To everyone's surprise, an explosion of light erupted, forcing Freddy to retreat. "Nice one, Emily," Sarah shouted, getting up with difficulty. Freddy growled, clearly irritated. "That won't work twice," he said, disappearing into the shadows. Sarah woke up abruptly, feeling exhausted and sore. Jake and Emily also woke up, both looking just as shaken as she was. "It worked," Emily said, still trembling. "We drove him away." "For now," Sarah replied. "He won't give up that easily." She looked at her hands and saw scratch marks, just like Jake and Emily. Freddy was becoming more real with each passing night, and they needed to find a way to stop him before it was too late. The next day, Sarah decided to return to the library. She needed more information about Freddy, something that could help them defeat him. As she sifted through the archives, she found an old book on occultism and dark entities. In the book, there was a passage that caught her attention. Entities that dwell in the world of dreams are fueled by fear and pain. To defeat them, one must confront them in their own domain, but with a clear mind and a fearless heart. The light of courage can dispel even the deepest shadows. Sarah knew what they had to do. They would have to face Freddy again, but this time they would be prepared. Sarah, Jake, and Emily knew they could no longer delay the inevitable. Freddy Krueger was growing stronger, and his incursions into their dreams were leaving real marks in the physical world. If they didn't act soon, he would end them all. Based on what they had learned, they came up with a plan. Sarah suggested they try to lure Freddy to a specific location within the dream, a place where they could control the environment and weaken him. They chose the Springwood Foundry, the place where Freddy had been burned alive. It was symbolic and perhaps the only place where they could defeat him once and for all. Before going to sleep, the three gathered at Sarah's house. They created a simple ritual based on what they had read in the occult book. They lit candles, drew protective symbols on the floor, and repeated mantras to strengthen their minds. "Remember," Sarah said, looking at Jake and Emily, "Freddy feeds on our fear. If we stay calm and focus on the light, we can defeat him." They lay down, each with a watch on their wrist to help them realize when they were dreaming. This time, they were determined to end the nightmare. Sarah woke up in the dark hallway of the factory, but this time the environment was different. The walls seemed to vibrate with a dark energy, and the air was heavy, as if the dream itself was rebelling against them. Jake and Emily appeared by her side, both looking determined. "Let's do this," Jake said, gripping a sword he had imagined. Emily nodded, holding a glowing shield that emitted a soft light. Freddy Krueger didn't take long to appear. He emerged from the shadows, his blades gleaming and his deformed face twisted into a cruel smile. "You came back," he said, laughing. "I knew you couldn't resist." "It's over, Freddy," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady. "You're not going to scare us anymore." Freddy laughed, but there was a hesitation in his eyes. He wasn't used to seeing his victim so confident. He lunged forward, moving swiftly toward Jake. Jake raised his sword, but Freddy struck it with ease, sending it flying from his hands. Emily intervened, using her shield to block Freddy's next strike. The light from the shield forced him to retreat, but he quickly recovered. Sarah focused, imagining chains to bind Freddy. They appeared out of nowhere, wrapping around his arms and legs. "You think this can hold me?" Freddy snarled, breaking the chains effortlessly. He advanced toward Sarah, his blades shining. She tried to move, but her legs wouldn't respond. Freddy was using her fear against her. That's when Emily had an idea. She closed her eyes and concentrated, imagining a bright light that filled the entire space. The light emerged, overwhelming and powerful, forcing Freddy to retreat. "Together!" Emily shouted. "Focus on the light!" Sarah and Jake closed their eyes, joining Emily. The light grew, becoming more and more intense. Freddy screamed, covering his face with his hands. "No, this isn't possible!" he roared, his form beginning to disintegrate. The light enveloped Freddy completely, and he began to dissolve like smoke in the wind. His distorted face twisted into an expression of rage and fear before disappearing entirely. Sarah woke up, feeling exhausted but relieved. She looked around and saw Jake and Emily waking up as well. They were all sweaty and trembling, but alive. "It worked," Jake said with a tired smile. "We defeated him." Emily hugged Sarah, crying with relief. "It's over. It's finally over." In the days that followed, the town of Ravenswood returned to normal. People stopped having nightmares, and the fear that had loomed over the town vanished. Sarah, Jake, and Emily knew they had done something incredible, but they also knew Freddy Krueger would not be forgotten. They visited the abandoned factory one last time, leaving flowers at the spot where Freddy had been burned alive. It was a symbolic gesture, a way to bury the past and move forward. "He's never really going to disappear, is he?" Emily asked, looking at the ruins of the factory. "No," Sarah replied, "but he can't hurt us anymore. We defeated him, and that's what matters. Sarah, Jake, and Emily went on with their lives, but they always remained close. They knew they had shared something unique, something that would bind them together forever. Sometimes, on the darkest nights, Sarah still felt a chill as she fell asleep. She knew Freddy Krueger was just a nightmare, but she also knew nightmares could be powerful. However, she also knew that as long as she had friends by her side and courage in her heart, no nightmare could defeat her.